Well, thank you, Stefan, and thanks Natalie and Ginny from the Salish Sea Institute for welcoming me here and bringing me down for a short sojourn south of the border, which is always nice to do, as long as I can get back north across the border. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about nearshore habitats and how to really coordinate and standardize monitoring of these habitats, not just in the Salish Sea, but expanding out and considering the global state of affairs with nearshore habitats. Okay, so when we talk about the rationale for this kind of research and monitoring around these types of habitats that are right on our coastlines, we often talk about, one, the importance of these habitats. They provide ecosystem services for us, for ecosystems. Most people in this room will know that. Okay, we also know that they're declining, and they're declining globally. So if we look at wetlands around the world, since we've started keeping tabs on these systems that include mangroves, marshes, estuaries, seagrasses, we know that they've declined around potentially 50%. If we break that down and look at seagrasses in particular, since the known date when we started having data, we know that they've declined by about 30%, and this has been accelerating through the 90s. For kelp forests, for macroalgae forests, they've been declining on the order of 2% per year. Okay, so we know these systems are declining when we look at the kind of collective whole of these systems globally. And so then we always talk about, okay, well, if these are declining, then we're going to lose these benefits to humans. And that's really the rationale given for doing more research and monitoring these systems and tracking that type of change. And what I'd like to reemphasize throughout this discussion today is that this is all, of course, very important, this framing, but what's perhaps more interesting is looking at the drivers of change across multiple different scales, so from local to more regional to global trends. And also how those differences really drive policy and change and practice across those different levels of governance. Okay, so we're going to go back to kind of the standard framing of things and look at climate change in our oceans. Of course, this is the most pervasive threat to our ecosystems that we know of today. And this is from a recent report published last year by the IPCC. It's the special report on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate. This is one section of it on changing oceans, marine ecosystems, and dependent communities. So we know that temperature, sea surface temperature, and atmospheric temperature is on the rise. I like this graph because it actually shows the total heat content of the ocean. So you can think of this as more like the bathtub of the combined oceans, coastal oceans, heating up. Their latent heat content is represented on the x-axis as latent energy. And on the other side, you'll see that that's then related to changes in sea level rise, so SLR. And we know because of thermal expansion that that's one of the main mechanisms causing changes in sea level rise. Okay, so this shows changes from year 2000 onwards, and it's, as most IPCC reports are displayed, it provides projections, models of what's going to happen into the future, given two different scenarios. And those two different scenarios that are displayed there are kind of a worst case scenario, which is in red. And that's basically we do nothing, business as usual, temperature continues to increase. And then blue is more, we actively change our policies currently. We don't increase our carbon emissions any further. And so those are kind of the latent emissions in the system. And that's what's causing that increase through time. Okay, so we know that there's large changes in these systems. This report tracks these physical changes caused by greenhouse gas, and it looks at them on a regional basis. So we can look in here at our local systems in the North Pacific and look at which of these parameters are changing, and are they increasing, which is in yellow, or are they decreasing in green? So if we look at temperature and sea level rise, those two parameters from the last graph, they're increasing, whereas oxygen and pH in green are decreasing in this region. And what's really nice about many of the IPCC reports is that they really tell you about the uncertainty. So how well do we know these systems and these changes through time? This is displayed graphically with these little circles there. So the one parameter, pH, that we know really well, that has 3 bubbles to it, we have high certainty that pH is really decreasing in this region. And in part, this is because we do have a really good assemblage of data from the North Pacific, from oceanographic research vessels that are telling us that they're witnessing large decreases in pH in the system. Okay, so this report goes on to look at how these physical changes associated with climate change are then related to the different types of coastal ecosystems along our coast. Okay, and I'm going to talk primarily about 2 systems, coastal wetlands, and focusing specifically on seagrasses, as well as kelp forests. And you can see that for coastal wetlands, those systems are projected to respond potentially in both directions. They might respond negatively, they might respond positively. Those are those 2 color shifts in that divider there. That's because these systems possess, many of them, some resilience to sea level rise depending on the system. Often many of those system types like seagrasses are photosynthesizers, so they actually like carbon. They'll suck it up, and to a certain extent, beyond a threshold, they can actually be positively affected. So, you know, the consensus of global science is we don't really know at this stage. We have kind of a medium level of certainty from this report on which direction these systems will go in. Okay, and then again, relating to this back to the standard framing, how are these systems, how are their ecosystem services affected? You can see that across these different ecosystem services here, which include fisheries, provision of fisheries, tourism, habitat services, so that's some of the buffering functions of the coast, some of the nutrient cycling functions, cultural services, and coastal carbon sequestration, they're all in pink, so they're all projected to have a negative effect on our coast, on those services. So for kelp and seagrass specifically, the ecosystem functions that they provide, these guys often act as buffers to coastal storms. They prevent erosion. You've probably heard a lot about this in your classes here. They can provide filters for coastal runoffs, this entering into our oceans. They can actually uptake some human pathogens and protect the oceans from spread of diseases in certain situations. They can provide habitat for food, and some of the food is really commercially and economically valuable to us, fish, invertebrates, crabs, for instance. And then nutrient cycling. So these habitats are very important in the nitrogen cycle, in the carbon cycle. And I wanted to, you know, hit home that point that coastal carbon sequestration, as some people in this audience know well, is getting its own bullet point now in the IPCC, and formerly this would have been lumped in with general habitat services from these systems. But now we're really kind of just starting to understand the importance of these systems for storing carbon and for having an impacts on global climate change and mitigation thereof of the changing systems. So we're seeing this in many kind of high-level reports that are painting a picture of the importance of these systems as natural climate solutions. So NCS, natural climate solutions, is the terminology that's being used. And many nations are actually including natural climate solution pathways. And this can be, for instance, through restoration of degraded habitats or for managing for their losses. Many of those countries are including policies around that in their NDCs. So those are the nationally determined contributions to global climate change emissions. Mouthful, but these are all important words to know, so I thought I'd pass them on. So this report doesn't just report on the North Pacific, it reports on systems throughout the globe. Okay, so all the major ocean basins globally, and also some specific seas. And you can see for coastal wetlands and kelp forests, generally, the trends hold throughout. There's mainly pink trends there, so mainly decreases in these habitats. There's not a high level of certainty for what's happening in these systems. And in part, this lack of certainty is not just from a lack of research and monitoring on the grounds across these different regions. It's because there's other factors beyond climate change that are also known to be major drivers of change for coastal habitats. So for instance, in the Salish Sea, in our neck of the woods, coastal development is often associated with eutrophication, modification of shorelines, pollution, and these are known factors to have impacts on our coastal ecosystems. And in many cases, these can actually negate or gloss over some of the climate change effects on seagrass. They can also interact with these effects on habitat. So for instance, we can have localized regional phenomenon like the blob or other heat waves that are potentially coming down the pipes that can interact with some of these more localized anthropogenic stressors on systems. So the challenge really of our era in terms of designing programs to monitor habitats across scale is really to build programs that can effectively monitor and do research, provide research at a localized base, but be able to scale up and understand the more pervasive threats of climate change and tease apart the different influence of these on ecosystems. And that's a really big task. It requires coordination globally, and that's something that the organization I work for, the Hakai Institute, as well as many other groups, governments, agencies, citizen science groups are participating in globally. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the work that we're doing and some of the partnerships with other collaborators coastwide. So the Hakai Institute operates as a base in British Columbia. We definitely spread across the borders up into Alaska and down into Washington, Oregon, Northern California as well. The temperate rainforest belt is really kind of our major area of research and networks. So we have two bases of operation. You can see where Vancouver is. Everyone's familiar with Vancouver. If you move up the coast, we have a base of operations, an observatory we call it, on Quadra Island, as well as one on the Central Coast on Calvert Island. And to show you what this locale looks like, first of all, this is in Huxley and Wekino territory. So those are the First Nations whose area we work in. This is kind of a shared region of overlap, and we work with them quite strongly. It's an area that provides a really good mix of habitat. So you have the exposed outer coast. Those are those sandy beaches with kelp forests. If you look west, you kind of end up going right between Vancouver Island and Haida Gwaii and all the way to Japan. And then on the other side, on the protective coast, there's muddy ecosystems, seagrass, more protected environments. So it allows us to do access and to do really good kind of year-round and yearly monitoring across these different system types, habitat types. So this is, where we are primarily working in British Columbia. It's a huge coast. This is bigger than the coastline of California, really, when you take into account all the convoluted nature of the coastline. And so from Prince Rupert in the north to Vancouver, we rely on work and partnerships with many different organizations. And many of those organizations are really governed by individual First Nations on the coast. So we work with the Haida Nation and Haida Gwaii. The Central Coast, we work, as I mentioned, with Huxley and Wekino First Nations. On Vancouver Island, we work with a group called Nanwakolis. And then we've partnered with a number of organizations, locally in the US and globally, to do this kind of standardized work to coordinate our research. And a big thrust of what we're doing right now is really providing some templates for centralized data that can be discoverable across scales. So one of our strongest partners right now is with the Smithsonian Institute. That's MarineGEO. And the goal of this group is to set up nodes globally of different research institutes that focus on long-term monitoring of coastal habitats. There's some other groups, such as AMBON, that are also doing similar work and occupying that space, but a little bit more focused on monitoring. MarineGEO is really focused on monitoring, but also paired with comparative experimental work as well. So we do experiments on an annual basis. And then I just wanted to mention some of the other groups. So Keene studies kelp forests. The Nature Conservancy is heading up a big project on kelp forests in California specifically, and PESCO does a lot of work in the intertidal zone and also in kelp forests. That's just to name a few of the groups kind of occupying this space. And then OBIS is the Ocean Biogeographic Information System, and we're testing this out as kind of a repository for some of the data sets that are being acquired by these multiple different agencies and groups. So for some of those physical variables that I mentioned, GOOSE is the Global Ocean Observing System, and this is the group that's really been charged, or has kind of led the charge actually, with coordinating data from the oceans globally. This shows a map of the global oceans, and each one of those boxes represents a different area, a different subregion that GOOSE covers, and then within those there are even kind of local regional nodes. So for Washington State, there's a group called NANUS that collects and aggregates all the oceanographic data, and then we're starting up a similar one for British Columbia and then Canada. You'll see it has a dotted line around it. That's just because it's just started. It's just getting going. Okay, so one of the ways to standardize this work and these data sets is to come up with standards, parameter level standards. And GOOSE started this focusing on those physical parameters I mentioned, so temperature, pH, oxygen in our oceans. We are now moving on to what I think are potentially the more interesting variables, and those are the ones related to coastal habitats. And developing biological and ecological EOVs. So again, these are essential ocean variables. And so we're working at this in a couple of different ways, and I want to tell you a little bit about what we're doing with kelp systems, and then if I have time, I'll tell you more about an example from seagrass habitats as well. So EOVs are things like a parameter for kelp canopy cover. So that's if you look at a specific area of the ocean, bird's eye view, how much area is covered by the canopy of kelps. And two, what is the composition of that canopy? What is it made up by? And we're working on this locally on the Central Coast with the Hakai Institute, and kind of pairing this with some work that's happening more globally with organizations that are working for that GOOSE network that I mentioned. Okay, so what does this look like in practice? It's a large collaboration with many different multiple entities collecting data in different ways. So we have divers that are doing surveys underwater collecting data on kelp. We have boats on the surface. And these primarily in British Columbia right now are manned by Indigenous stewardship groups. There's an organization called the Coastal Guardian Watchmen that does a lot of this work. They're collecting surface cover data. And then we also use aerial imagery. So that can be collected in a number of different ways. I'll talk about some of the ways. We work with that in partnership with Guardians. We use drones, or UAVs, uncrewed aerial vehicles is the current language for that I'll be using. And we also collect satellite imagery with other research partners at universities in BC to cover a lot of ground spatially. Okay, so our dive crew underwater collects really fine-grained information on many of the parameters in the kelp forests. And we've been doing this, we did this through 3 years and got really good seasonal data to understand the productivity of these different kelp forests, how they're changing through time. So that's basically how much biomass of kelp is out there, how much biomass of the entire ecosystem is out there, and how is it changing through time. So to do this, we collect a huge number of different parameters. This is all methodology that has evolved from work in the LTER, from the LTER research group in Santa Barbara. And we put it together, we're in the process of putting it together in models so we can piece together information on, for instance, the stipe of a kelp and the blades to come up with an aggregate measure of biomass for this system. And then we also collect information on the quality of these tissues in kelp as another metric of change, and also fish in inverts associated with these habitats. So a lot of very detailed underwater that's collected at a couple of key research sites that the Hakai Institute takes care of. So to scale this up, we need good information on how what we see underwater is then related to what we can see more easily at the surface. And so to see what's happening at the surface, we use boats. And the Indigenous Watchmen groups are able to run boats around the perimeter of kelp beds, tell us how big it is. They also go into the beds and measure what's happening on the surface layer of the canopy. And they also use drones as well to get at those very similar measurements. So the training with the Guardian Watchmen usually starts out every year in the spring before the field season. We do an overview of what the different kelp species are, because it's really important. There's two major canopy forming species, Nearshore, which is bull kelp, and Macrocystis, which is the giant kelp. It's really important to be able to distinguish these in the field. And then the different groups go out, and with boats and with kayaks, again, they collect information on how big is the kelp bed and what kind of density of canopy do you see within the kelp bed. So they do things like putting down quadrats. You can see this one from space, and they count the number of bulbs for Nearshore within an area to give us an estimate of density within that bed. So those boat-based measurements, as I mentioned, are complemented with drone UAV aerial imagery. And so this is all methods that have been developed by our Hakai team led by Luba Rashitnik here. We've developed methods, and then we train other trainers that work with the people in the field to fly drones at all of our sites. So here's what it looks like. This is actually a mother-daughter duo up on the north coast of Vancouver Island that's launching a drone to do a flyover of a kelp bed that they're monitoring. And then ultimately where we're going with this is that we overlay this imagery from drones with our dive transects underwater and the information from those dive transects, the data, and we're looking to find correlations between the total biomass or productivity of the system underwater and what we see with drones. And we're doing this because it's much easier to fly drones. It's much easier to get information above the surface than it is to do these dive surveys. Okay, and so that work is focused at kind of the site level, at local scales, where kelp are very important locally. And we complement that with aerial imagery that can cover much larger scales. So we often use different forms of satellite data to get that type of information. And one of the satellites that we've been using is WorldView 2. It's now been replaced by WorldView 3, so it's getting finer and finer, but you can actually look down to 0.5 meter scale. So that's a pretty small area. You can see that with the lens, and that allows us to actually distinguish different types of kelp within an imagery. So we use object-based image analysis. This is a way to partition your data based on shared attributes of the system, and then we can classify those and get information on kelp extent by those two different species, Nearshore and Macrocystis, that I mentioned. And so that's what you can see in the map here. You can see the differences clearly between water and kelp beds, and then also between Macrocystis and Nearshore in yellow and red. Okay, so I hope I've kind of illustrated with this multi-rung kelp data that we're working on these methods to get really standardized from drone imagery and from satellites, good information on canopy cover and composition. And then some of the other EOVs that have been described include traits of the kelp, so we get that from our subsurface dive surveys as well, and community diversity as well. And these essential ocean variables have been put forward globally, and we're finding that they really do work well in our neck of the woods in British Columbia. And so we're working actually with Friday Harbor Labs and MarineGEO to start implementing some of these as routine monitoring measurements in the Salish Sea as well, Salish Sea South. Okay, so our work with kelp really is focused in British Columbia, working with Indigenous Guardian Watchmen. We do similar work with seagrass, but I wanted to show you a different example where we're working from kind of the global and going to local, going in that direction. So the other direction to the kelp work. And this is work that we're doing on seagrass wasting disease with MarineGEO and a bunch of other collaborators. It's an NSF research grant. I've actually just come back from a check-in workshop in this in Seattle. So seagrass wasting disease, I'll tell you a little bit more about that. It is not sea star wasting disease. It's different. And we're looking at the trends of this disease all the way from Alaska down to San Diego. So we're one partner in this group, but there's groups in Alaska here, in Friday Harbor Labs, Oregon, Northern California at Bodega Bay, and also in San Diego. So we're looking at the prevalence and severity across the Northeast Pacific coast of this disease, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what I mean by prevalence and severity. Seagrass wasting disease is a slime mold. It's a labyrinthula, and it is prevalent inside the tissues of seagrass. And you can see it as these small black necrotic patches within seagrass. So next time you're down at the shore and you see seagrass that's washed in and it's not completely dried out, pick it up and see if you can see any black patches on it. There's other things that also cause black patches, but these have really distinguishable margins. When I talk about prevalence of the disease, I mean, is it present in one site or not? Do you have any evidence it exists? And severity is really the magnitude of the disease when it exists at a given site. I should also say that we're doing this work in part because there's a potential that it's been associated with some local declines in Washington State. There's some areas, Westcott Bay and the San Juan Islands, where there's been fairly large declines or if not losses of seagrass. And in other regions of the coast, for instance in British Columbia where I work, we see it, but we don't think that it's at this stage having a negative effect on the system. So we're trying to get a handle on the variability in the disease across the coast and kind of trying to anticipate what some of the major drivers of it are. If the temperature continues to increase with climate change, might we reach some sort of threshold where this disease then has a negative effect? So in terms of standardized parameters, this project looks at metrics of seagrass community health. So we count the density of the plants, their morphological characteristics. We look at the animal community associated with seagrass. And we also, again, use drones to look at the size of a bed. We want to see if the size of the bed is shifting through time. We collect disease blades in the field and bring it home to look at those two metrics, disease prevalence and severity. So what this looks like in practice is you take your seagrass and you actually scan every single leaf and you score it for, one, can you see what you think is labby. Labby is short form for labyrinthula, lesion on the blade. And two, how widespread is it across that seagrass blade? And then we also have people simultaneously that are taking swabs of those blades and analyzing the microbial community to see if that is impacting the spread of the disease. So some late-breaking initial trends. This is our first year of the project, and I just wanted to show this one. This shows the prevalence of the disease coastwide across the different sites that I mentioned. This one starts up north in Alaska, then BC, Washington, And I wanted to show this here because Washington, as I said, has the highest level of seagrass wasting disease than other sites, than Oregon, Bodega Bay, and San Diego. So you can see that there's quite a lot of variability coastwide, which is going to be beneficial for really looking at the difference in drivers across this region. So in terms of implementation of these essential ocean variables, they have been kind of incorporated into this project. And so we are collecting information on variables such as chute density, percent cover, and aerial cover, all of which has been established under consensus of the global seagrass community as important things to mention. Okay, so that's one way that we're going about standardizing these parameters globally, and we're kind of illustrating that with the example from the Pacific Northeast coastline. Okay, so why is it important to have these EOVs and have them publicly available? I mentioned the emerging work on natural climate solutions, pathways. I've been working on a synthesis of this for Canada. Here's a map of the global distribution of blue carbon ecosystems. But when you look nationally, we haven't to date been able to aggregate all the information and put it together to understand on a whole, how does seagrass, for instance, lead to carbon storage in our systems? And we're just starting to do that. But at this stage, because we don't yet have these global repositories of biological and ecological EOVs, mouthful, it's hard to do. So you can piece together the important components of the puzzle. You can piece together data we have on Seagrass Extent that we acquire from those drone images. We can also piece together information on carbon storage content. This is a late-breaking publication led by people in this audience that shows the distribution of carbon storage in the Pacific Northwest. So this is really important information that shows the variability in carbon in sediments of seagrass, and for the first time we have this information in a database form. And so in order to really bring this to government, bring this information together, we need to have a good system to integrate this field data. And we are kind of working within this framework of GOOSE, that global session of ocean observing data, to make that happen and to facilitate it. So just to illustrate this, what this actually looks like and the different steps in the process. From the field, you bring the data back to the lab or to your computer. Data processing is really important. Going through the data and doing the QC process is really kind of crucial to making sure that you have a high quality data set. We're then putting together our data into data packages. And those packages are going online and are available in what we call metadata catalogs. So these are searchable catalogs that you can go to, and it shows you who has the data, where you can access it, what year it covers, everything you need to know about this data set. These metadata catalogs, these records, are really the framework we're using and Goose is using to help us search and retrieve the different pieces of data that the different levels of government are interested in. Okay, so these get aggregated by subregions. So in British Columbia, this is the Seus node. It's equivalent to Nanus, which would be where all the data from the Salish Sea, from Washington State, from Oregon goes. So we provide this data internally to our databases. It goes up to those subregional nodes. And then that data is then aggregated in this kind of collective Goose repository. And so the vision is that this then provides a way for local kind of control and direction of management of data where that's needed, but a way to harvest the data and scale up across levels. So for instance, if you're interested in doing these natural climate solution inventories at the global level, you would then go to the Goose data site, and you'd be able to access all the information on Seagrass Extent, blue carbon data globally, and find it all there. But if you're interested in doing this within Canada or locally, say for instance in the Pacific Northwest in the Salish Sea, you would go then to your home base. You'd go to your Pacific node and find the relevant information there. Okay, and the goal is also that this is all publicly available information, the data that is publicly available, and that the different scales of governance can access this data, as well as community-based organizations. So I know the data management stuff is a little bit dry, but I wanted to put a plug out for that. If you Google Hakai, we've just put out a "We're Hiring" video. And it's a really great place to work, but the skills that are needed for undergraduates nowadays, lots of them are not only related to field skills, but also to data management, to data visualization, et cetera. So those skills are highly sought after, and I encourage everyone to acquire some of those skills during their undergraduate career. So that's it. I want to say thank you to a huge group with the Hakai Institute. This covers most of the people on our team. We work with a bunch of different researchers, a huge field team, and many different postdocs that are based at universities, primarily in British Columbia. And then I wanted to acknowledge some of our research partners, which include individual First Nations groups, as well as First Nations organizations, and some of the other academic and research partners in British Columbia. So that's all for me, and I welcome any questions from the audience. Oops. There we go. That's a nice, pretty picture to leave up.
Like when in the San Juans with the large amount of eelgrass or seagrass dying, does it create a noxious environment?
I haven't run across any situations where it dies en masse and then kind of creates like an anoxic, muddy pile. Not to say that it couldn't, especially after like a heat wave or a mass die-off, but often those are very, in the San Juans anyways, they're very active, dynamic systems, so everything's kind of moving around. Yeah, so it could potentially happen, but I haven't heard of any records of that. Yeah. Yeah.
Have you run into any issues with like people opposing you want to come in and do research in these areas, or not really?
Well, no, and in part because we're often working with community partners in different organizations. There's lots of sensitivities over data sharing, and that's, I kind of discussed a little bit about that, but because of historic events and lack of trust, not everyone wants their data about their local area to be publicly open and available. So I think that's maybe where sometimes there's some resistance about doing monitoring work where you're collecting data arises. Yeah.
So I know that you mentioned at least like a handful of them, but do you have any idea how many EOVs you guys have like come up with or have been able to monitor? Or is it just the ones that you talked about in this presentation?
So the EOVs have like different levels of priorities, and the ones that I did mention there, percent cover, aerial cover, and density are the primary ones that they're using globally. And then below that, there's supporting variables, and there's a bunch of other ones for that. Yeah, so they put out basically a specs sheet based on the consensus of global seagrass scientists to come up with those, and then they're kind of working on refining those. Yeah, But if you're looking for, if you want to do seagrass monitoring, this is what to do. MarineGEO is actually a pretty good resource for that. They have some documentation up online, and wherever you go regionally, there's also usually local organizations that have information on that. Yeah.
So you said the Guardian is like the Guardian Watch Group. That's all Indigenous peoples working?
Yeah, that stems from different nations in British Columbia. Yep.
Are there any other examples of Indigenous groups doing work like this along the coast, or just in that area?
Well, there's global examples. And they're actually calling them guardians in different regions too. So there's other groups in Canada. There was an international conference and exchange with Australia a while back. I don't know entirely about Washington tribes and where they're involved. I know there's interest in Alaska, but there's not a kind of anything formalized right now.
Have you made any observations about deoxygenation in the area that you've been working?
So within the seagrass beds themselves, or
in nearshore areas where you've been working?
In nearshore areas. Yes. In the nearshore, there's so much water exchange and tidal action and waves that if you actually look like right in the nearshore habitats themselves, they actually usually don't suffer from deoxygenation. But if you look at depth in some of these near coastal systems, then you do find long-term changes. So our oceanographic group has kind of compiled long-term time series from an area on the central coast, and they show long-term decreases in oxygen, but at depth. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Have you contacted or associated working with the Monterey Bay Aquarium and Oceanographic Research Station at Moss Landing? I'm quite familiar with that. It became when I was associated with it, it was a fishing harbor, but then now it's transformed into the UC system. Have you worked with any of those people along the Central California coast?
Mm-hmm. We have, we've done some work around sea otters and their effects on these coastal systems, and through that work, down in Elkhorn Slough, which comes out right at Moss Landing, we've done a lot of work with them. And then Mbari, which you're talking more about the UC system and Moss Landing,
Yes.
but the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, which is a Packard-funded research institute, they were actually Hakai Institute was kind of actually modeled after that. Hakai Institute is also non-profit, it's a charity, and so is Mbari, and doing a lot of high-tech work that's also very applied. So we've interacted with them on that front as well. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Natalie.
Yes. Could you speak a little bit more about what can happen with the data that is assembled through these monitoring networks to move into the governance and policy realm? Like, how are people using the data that's being collected to make decisions about habitat restoration? Could you just share a little bit more about some examples of that?
Some examples beyond my natural climate solutions one, because that's really a good one. It's been earmarked as something globally we need to get a handle on. All the countries need to start paying attention to this in their national level climate mitigation strategies. But then when you go to actually do the work and create policy based on the resources that you actually have, that's where we lack data and information. And so for instance, for Canada right now, I'm trying to assess the capability of seagrass throughout all of Canada to sequester carbon, but we don't have a center point to go to collect information on total extent of seagrass on the coast. That doesn't exist. So if we did have these systems and we did have people on the ground collecting the data, it would be there and available to use. Yeah, so and the same like parallel could be taken for kind of any of those habitat services related to any of these habitats. Yeah.
Since a citizen science, you're using a lot of data from them, could you expand a little bit more on the QA/QC and make sure that you're meeting your data quality objectives?
Yeah, so I mean, QA/QC runs from looking at your spreadsheet and making sure there's no outliers, that nothing looks off, that the means look good, and just kind of walking through each line of data that you collect in the field and making sure that passes a certain quality check level. And then some of the work we do with our spatial data is about actually validating and ground truthing the data. And that's where we're not actually, we've got plans to do this, but the Indigenous stewardship offices, most of them have GIS departments. They're actually processing some of the data, but we really need their local knowledge because they're the eyes on the water to actually tell us if the computer making these polygons is actually doing the right thing. So if it's making a polygon around something and it's calling that kelp, we then need kind of validation from people on top of that to say, yes, that is actually kelp, or no, you totally got that wrong. That is a marsh that it's drawing a circle around. So I think that's another really important part of the QA/QC process. Yeah.